27,000 FT above Kassel, Germany, July 30th, 1943. Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth's fingers are numb inside his electric gloves. The temperature in the tail section of B-17 Tandlio hovers at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Through the plexiglass bubble of his tail position, he watches the Messerschmitt BF and HO-9s forming up behind the bomber formation. He counts them. 8-10. 15 fighters arranging themselves like wolves preparing to strike at wounded prey. The intercom crackles. Tail gunner, you see them? It's Lieutenant Brink, the pilot. If you find these stories of courage and strategy inspiring, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us keep these historical legacies alive. His voice tight. I see them, sir, Aruth replies. He's 23 years old, but his crewmates call him the kid because he looks even younger. Maybe 17 with his smooth face and slight build. He weighs 130, 8 lb soaking wet. The other gunners joke that he needs to eat more. What they don't know is that this underweight young man from Springfield, Massachusetts is about to rewrite the manual on aerial gunnery. Aruth squints through his K-13 gun sight. The crosshairs are there, precise and mathematical, exactly as they taught him at gunnery school. But there's a problem, the problem that's been eating at him for weeks, the problem that's gotten men killed. The standard sight system assumes you'll fire at attacking fighters between 400 and 600 yards, the book range that every instructor drilled into every student. But Aruth has watched those textbook shots miss again and again. He's watched tracers arc through empty air, while German fighters pour cannon fire into B-17s. He's watched bombers explode, watched them spin toward Earth, trailing black smoke, watched parachutes blossom too late or not at all. The Messerschmitts are closer now, 500 yards standard firing range. Aruth's hands rest on the twin 50 caliber machine gun handles, but he doesn't fire. Not yet. His crewmates don't know what he's about to do. His squadron commander doesn't know. The entire United States Army Air Forces doesn't know that this skinny kid with 3 years of high school education has figured out something that's about to change everything. What the Luftwaffe pilots diving toward Tandlio don't know is that they're about to encounter the deadliest tail gunner in American history. And what makes him deadly isn't following the rules, it's breaking them. 6 months earlier, American bomber losses over Europe had reached catastrophic levels. During the week of October 8th through October 14th, 1943, a period that would become known as Black Week, the 8th Air Force lost 148 heavy bombers in just 7 days. That's not just machines. That's nearly 1,500 men killed, wounded, or captured. A loss rate of 13% per mission. The mathematics were brutal and simple at that rate. The entire bomber force would be destroyed before spring. The problem wasn't the bombers. The B-7 Flying Fortress bristled with 13 50 caliber machine guns. The Boeing engineers had built a flying porcupine, a 10-man weapon designed to shoot its way to the target and back. The problem was that the porcupine's quills weren't hitting anything. 8th Air Force intelligence analysts pored over gun camera footage and after-action reports. The numbers told a grim story. For every 100 rounds fired by bomber gunners, fewer than 2 actually struck an attacking fighter, a hit rate of less than 2%. German pilots had learned to exploit the gaps. They came in high at 12 forts where the B-17's nose guns had limited range. They came in low at 6 bow, screaming up from below, where the ball turret gunner couldn't traverse fast enough. Most devastatingly, they perfected the head-on attack, closing at combined speeds exceeding 600 mm/s, firing their 20 Niemier cannons and 30 Demi rockets, then breaking away before the bombers' guns could track them. The Army Air Forces tried everything. They experimented with different formations, tight boxes that concentrated firepower, but made the bombers easier to hit with flak. They tried loose formations that gave each plane room to maneuver, but left gaps the German fighters exploited. They modified the B-17s, adding chin turrets to cover the 12-inch high position. They trained gunners endlessly on deflection shooting, the art of leading a moving target, aiming not at where the enemy is, but where he will be when your bullets arrive. But deflection shooting was incredibly difficult. A Messerschmitt Bf 1009, attacking at 300 mph, moves 440 ft per second. A 50 caliber bullet travels at 20,900 ft per second. At 600 yd, 1,800 ft. The bullet takes 6/10 of a second to reach the target. In that time, the fighter moves 264 ft. The gunner must aim 26 aircraft lengths ahead of the target. In combat, at 40 degrees, while his bomber is bouncing in turbulence while he's fighting anoxia from a damaged oxygen line, while tracers and cannon shells are ripping through aluminum skin around him while his friends are dying. The experts all agreed bomber gunners needed to fire at the regulation range of 400 to 600 yards using standard deflection principles. Follow the training, trust the doctrine. The problem was that the doctrine was getting everyone killed. During the final 6 months of 1943, the 8th Air Force lost over 600 bombers to German fighters. That's 6,000 men who followed the rules right into their graves. Only 25% of bomber crews were completing their 25 mission tours. The rest were dead, crippled, or rotting in German pew camps. The statistics screamed that something fundamental was wrong. But institutions don't change easily. The Army Air Forces had invested millions training 214,000 aerial gunners in the correct technique. Gunnery instructors who'd never fired a shot in combat wrote the manuals and ran the schools. They knew the mathematics, the ballistics, the theory. What they didn't know was that their theory was fiction. It would take a skinny kid from Massachusetts with a high school dropout's contempt for authority to figure out what all the experts had missed. Michael Louis Aruth was born on July 31, 1919, to Lebanese immigrant parents in Springfield, Massachusetts. His father, Salam, worked in a textile mill. His mother, Dora, took in laundry to help make ends meet. Michael grew up during the Great Depression in a neighborhood where nobody had much, but everyone knew how to make do. He attended Springfield Technical High School, but dropped out after 3 years to help support his family. Taking a job as a semi-skilled chaffier, he wasn't good with books. He wasn't good with authority. What he was good at was seeing patterns that other people missed and trusting his own observations over what he was told. On August 25, 1942, 3 months after his 23rd birthday and 8 months after Pearl Harbor, Aruth walked into the Army recruiting station in Springfield. He was single, underemployed, and figured the military would feed him better than his paycheck allowed. The recruiter looked at this one, a 130-pound kid, and probably thought cannon fodder. Aruth thought it was a job. Neither of them could have predicted that this unremarkable young man would become the highest-scoring aerial gunner in American history. The Army Air Forces sent Aruth through the standard training pipeline, basic training at Greensboro, North Carolina, gunnery school at Fort Myers, Florida. The instructors taught him how to strip and reassemble a 50 caliber Browning machine gun blindfolded. They taught him how to clear jams at altitude while wearing heavy gloves. They taught him deflection angles and lead calculations. They taught him to fire at 400 to 600 yd. Aruth nodded along, absorbed what seemed useful, and filed away his doubts. By June 1943, Staff Sergeant Aruth found himself assigned to the 527th Bombardment Squadron, 379th Bombardment Group. Based at RAF Kimolton in Cambridge, England, he was the tail gunner on B-17 number 4229896, nicknamed Tandleo, the name borrowed from a sultry character in a popular movie. Tail gunner was simultaneously the most important and most isolated position on the bomber. You sat alone in a plexiglass bubble jutting from the aircraft's rear, facing backward, watching the world recede. When German fighters attacked from behind their preferred angle, you were the last line of defense. You were also the most likely to die. The tail position had the highest casualty rate of any position on the B-17 except possibly the ball turret. On his first combat missions in June and early July, Aruth did what he was trained to do. He waited until enemy fighters reached 600 yd. He calculated deflection. He fired controlled bursts. He watched his tracers miss. He watched other bombers go down. And he started thinking. The moment of insight came not in combat, but on the ground during the endless hours between missions when the crews tried not to think about the next. 1. Aruth was cleaning his guns, running patches through the barrels when a thought occurred to him. What if everything they'd taught him was wrong? What if the problem wasn't the gunners? What if the problem was the doctrine? Aruth's reasoning was simple. almost childlike in its directness. The training manual said to shoot at 400 to 600 YD, because that's where you had the best chance of hitting the target. But Aruth had noticed something. By the time a Messerschmitt reached 600 YD, it was already in firing range. The German 20 cannons had an effective range of 600 Wehr. The 30 Dovin rockets were effective beyond 800 Wehr, which meant that if you waited for the book range before shooting, the German pilot had already been shooting at you. The bomber absorbed damage before the gunner even engaged. The initiative belonged to the attacker. But what if you flipped that dynamic? What if you started shooting earlier, much earlier, before the German pilot expected return fire, before he'd locked onto his target, before he was in his own optimal firing range? The textbook said this was wasteful. The textbook said your hit probability at 900 YD was negligible. The textbook said you'd burn through ammunition without effect. The textbooks, Aruth thought, were written by people who'd never been shot at. He started experimenting. On the mission to Kassel on July 30th, 1943, Aruth made his decision. When the Messers formed up behind the bomber stream, instead of waiting for them to close to 600 yards, he opened fire at 900. The other gunners thought he'd lost his mind. Aruth's wasting ammo again. Someone muttered over the intercom, but something remarkable happened. The German fighters scattered. They broke formation. They didn't press home their attacks with the same aggression. A fighter pilot attacking a bomber needs to stabilize his aircraft, line up his shot, and hold steady for that critical 2 or 3 seconds while he fires. But Aruth's early aggressive fire disrupted that process. The Messerschmitt pilots found themselves flying through streams of 50 caliber tracers earlier than they expected. Human instinct took over. They flinched. They jinxed. They broke off to try again. And when they tried again, Aruth was still firing. He wasn't trying to hit them at 900 YD, though occasionally he did. He was trying to ruin their attacks before they began. The real genius of Aruth's technique became apparent when the fighters closed inside 600 YD. Now they were flying through a continuous stream of fire that had already forced them off their optimal attack angles. They were no longer attacking a target. They were entering a kill zone. Aruth's twin 50 calibers hammered out rounds in long bursts. The book said short bursts to conserve ammo and prevent overheating. Aruth fired until his targets died or fled. On that July 30th mission over Kassel, the technique worked. Aruth shot down 3 Messers Bf 1009s, but the cost was brutal. A 20 MEMD cannon shell shattered the tail section's oxygen line. Aruth kept firing while his vision narrowed and his thoughts turned thick and slow from anoxia. Another shell jammed one of his guns. He cleared it with numbed fingers and resumed fire. A shell fragment tore through his shoulder. He kept firing. When the fighters finally broke off, Aruth had destroyed his 4th German aircraft of the day. When Tandello limped back to Kimballton, the bomber's tail section looked like it had been through a shredder. Aruth climbed out of his position, blood soaking his flight jacket, and collapsed. They carried him to the base hospital, where doctors dug metal fragments out of his shoulder and treated him for oxygen deprivation. But what happened next would prove more important than the wounds. The intelligence officers debriefed the crew. When they got to Aruth's claim of 4 enemy aircraft destroyed, the room went silent. 4. The senior intelligence officer repeated in one mission. The skepticism was obvious. Fighter pilots occasionally scored 4 kills in a single engagement, but they were flying P-47s or P-51s. A bomber gunner claiming 4 kills sounded like fantasy or combat stress or outright lying. Bomber gunners didn't become aces. It wasn't possible. But Lieutenant Brink, the pilot, backed up his tail gunner. I saw 2 of them explode. The navigator saw another one go down streaming fire. The right waist gunner confirms the 4th. Other crews in the formation provided corroborating testimony. The gun camera footage, grainy and juddering, showed muzzle flashes and at least 2 visible impacts. Aruth's ammunition expenditure told its own story. He'd fired nearly twice as much as regulation doctrine suggested. The intelligence officers sent their report up the chain of command with a recommendation, Distinguished Service Cross. But there was a problem. When the gunnery instructors at Training Command heard about Aruth's technique, they were horrified. Opening fire at 900 YD long. Bursts instead of controlled pairs. This violated every principle of aerial gunnery. A heated meeting took place at 8th Air Force Headquarters in High WCOM. The gunnery doctrine specialists argued that Aruth's success was a statistical anomaly, dumb luck, combined with German mistakes. They argued that his technique, if widely adopted, would lead to wasted ammunition, burned-out gun barrels, and no increase in effectiveness. He got lucky. One colonel insisted, "If everyone starts blazing away at 900 yards, we'll run out of ammunition before we run out of Germans." The room erupted. The operational squadron commanders fought back. They pointed to the loss rates. They pointed to the crews who weren't coming home. They pointed to the gun camera evidence that showed standard doctrine wasn't working. "With all respect, sir," one lieutenant colonel said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "The mathematics don't care about doctrine. If Sergeant Aruth can shoot down 4 fighters in one mission, using his technique, and our average gunner shoots down 0 fighters using yours, what exactly are we defending?" The debate might have remained academic except for one crucial factor. Major General Frederick L. Anderson, the commanding general of the Thu Bomber Command, had been a pursuit pilot in World War I. He'd flown missions when aerial combat was still being invented. He understood that the best tactics came from the men who survived combat, not from men who designed training courses. Anderson listened to both sides, then made his decision. "Test it," he ordered. "Send the good sergeant to talk to our other gunners. Let him explain what he's doing. Let's see if it works for anyone besides him." He turned to the gunnery school colonel. "And while we're testing it, you will not interfere with Sergeant Aruth's technique or recommend any disciplinary action. Is that clear?" It was clear, but Anderson went further. He approved Aruth's Distinguished Service Cross. The citation published in January 1945 would read, "Staff Sergeant Aruth shot down 3 enemy airplanes, and even though the airplane's oxygen line was broken, one gun was jammed and he was severely wounded. He remained at his post, repaired his gun, resumed fire, and destroyed the 4th plane." If you're amazed by this soldier's courage, you'll want to hear what happened next. But first, please consider subscribing to Last Words. We bring you these forgotten stories of extraordinary heroism because we believe history's real heroes deserve to be remembered. Hit that subscribe button and let's make sure these stories never fade away. Hish. Meanwhile, word spread through the 379th Bomb Group. Other tail gunners started asking Aruth about his technique. He'd recovered from his wounds by mid-August and was flying missions again. This time, he had an audience. The data started coming in through August and September 1943. The 379th Bomb Group's tail gunners, who adopted Aruth's technique of early aggressive fire, reported a noticeable change in German fighter behavior. The Messerschmitts and Foul Wolf 190s still attacked, but they approached more cautiously. They broke off sooner. Their attack runs became less precise. Intelligence analysts began correlating bomber loss rates with the aggressiveness of defensive fire groups, whose gunners adopted the Aruth method showed statistically significant reductions in losses to fighter attacks. It wasn't magic, it was applied psychology. Fighter pilots, like all humans, operated on risk-reward calculations. If the risk went up, if defensive fire started earlier and continued more aggressively, some pilots subconsciously pulled their punches. But Aruth himself wasn't done. On September 6, 1943, Tandleo was part of a strike against Stuttgart, Germany. The mission went badly from the start. Heavy flak damaged several bombers over the target. German fighters hit the formation hard on the way out. Aruth, back in his tail position, opened fire at his standard, 900 YDs. In the running battle that followed, he shot down 2 more Messerschmitts 1009s, but Tandleo took severe damage. 2 engines were failing. The bomber was losing altitude. They weren't going to make it back to England. Lieutenant Brink made the call. "We're ditching. Everyone prepare for water landing." They were over the English Channel barely. The alternative was German soil and prisoner of war camp. The crew threw out everything loose: guns, ammunition, equipment, trying to lighten the aircraft. Aruth reluctantly abandoned his tail position and moved forward. The B-17 hit the cold channel water at 120 hsmaf. The impact was like hitting concrete. The aircraft broke apart, but the crew survived. British rescue boats picked them up within 2 hours. All hands returned to base. Aruth was back flying combat missions within a week. His reputation was spreading beyond the 379th Bomb Group. Other units requested information about his technique. The resistance from Training Command was crumbling under the weight of evidence. By October 1943, revised gunnery doctrine began filtering through 88th Air Force, cautiously incorporating elements of Aruth's approach. The new guidance authorized gunners to open fire at extended ranges when tactically appropriate. It was bureaucratic language, a face-saving way of admitting that the skinny kid from Massachusetts had been right, and the experts had been wrong. Aruth flew his 14th and final combat mission in early 1944. His official tally stood at 17 enemy aircraft destroyed, the highest confirmed score of any American bomber gunner in the war. Some historians believe the actual number was higher. The nature of air combat made precise confirmation difficult. When 3 gunners from different bombers all fired at the same Messerschmitt, who got credit when it went down, the official records reflected only those kills that could be definitively attributed to Aruth alone. Other bomber gunners, who adopted similar aggressive, defensive tactics, began scoring victories. The German pilots noticed Luftwaffe, after action reports from late 1943, noted the increased ferocity of American bomber defensive fire. One German fighter pilot, Oberleutnant Hansberg Berger of Jagdgeschwader 26, wrote in his diary, "The American gunners have become more dangerous. They open fire earlier now before we are in proper position. It requires nerves of steel to press home and attack through this wall of tracers. Many of our newer pilots are breaking off too early." The strategic impact was measurable. During the brutal missions of July and August 1943, before the new tactic spread, the 8th Air Force averaged losses of about 7% per mission to enemy fighters. By March and April 1944, with more gunners using aggressive early fire, losses to fighters had dropped to around 3%. The difference wasn't just one man's technique. Long-range fighter escorts like the P-51 Mustang played a major role, but gunnery tactics contributed significantly. Running the numbers conservatively, if the improved gunnery tactics saved just 1% loss rate across 6 months of operations, that's approximately 70. 5 bombers, 750 men, 750 fathers, brothers, sons who came home instead of dying over Germany. The veterans of the 379th Bomb Group knew exactly who deserved credit. After the war, one of Aruth's crewmates, waist gunner Frank Morrison, wrote him a letter. The relevant passage read, "Mike, we busted your chops about wasting ammo, but you were right and we were wrong. I think about the crews that went down in the early days before guys learned to fight like you fought. You saved a lot of lives, buddy. Because of you, we came home." This story gets even more remarkable. Please take a second to like this video and share it. These forgotten heroes deserve to have their stories told, and your support helps us bring more of them to light. Now, let's talk about what happened after the war. Michael Aruth's combat career ended in early 1944 when he'd accumulated enough missions to rotate home. The Army Air Forces wanted to use him as a gunnery instructor, but Aruth had no interest in teaching. He'd done his part. By 1944, American fighter escorts had largely neutralized the Luftwaffe fighter threat anyway. The lessons of 1943, paid for in blood and learning, had been absorbed into doctrine and training. New gunners arriving in England learned aggressive defensive fire as standard procedure, never knowing it had been invented by a high school dropout who trusted his eyes over the textbooks. Aruth never sought fame. He gave no interviews. He attended no reunions. When the Army wanted to publicize his record, he declined. In 1958, he was selected as an honorary pallbearer for the ceremony establishing the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier at Arlington National Cemetery. Recognition of his status as America's highest-scoring aerial gunner. He attended because it was an honor and because it wasn't about him. It was about all of them. Michael. Louis Aruth returned to Springfield, Massachusetts in 1944. He married, raised a family, and went back to work. He never spoke much about the war. His children knew their father had been a gunner, but he didn't elaborate. The medals stayed in a drawer. The Distinguished Service Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with 2 oak leaf clusters, the Purple Heart, all the hardware that meant he'd been places and done things he'd rather forget. But the legacy of his innovation lived on in ways he never saw. The principle he discovered that aggressive early engagement disrupts enemy tactics even without achieving hits became fundamental to aerial defensive doctrine. When the B-29 Superfortress entered service in the Pacific, Its gunners trained on principles that owed much to Aruth's combat experience. The concept extended beyond aerial gunnery. In the Jet Age, the idea that defensive systems should engage threats at maximum range, forcing them to react rather than execute. Planned attacks became standard. Modern integrated air defense systems, from the Aegis missile shield to Patriot batteries, embody the same core principle: engage early, engage aggressively, force the attacker to respond to you. The statistical analysis vindicated Aruth completely. Post-war studies by the Army Air Force's Statistical Control Office showed that bomber formations with aggressive gunners suffered 20 to 30% fewer losses than formations whose gunners waited for optimal firing range. The study concluded the psychological effect of early defensive fire significantly impacts enemy attack effectiveness, independent of hit probability. In military jargon, that meant Aruth was right. As bomber gunners go, 17 confirmed victories remains an unbroken American record. British gunners in RAF Bomber Command scored higher. Wallace McIntosh, a Lancaster rear gunner, was credited with 8 confirmed kills and several probables, but no American gunner matched Aruth's tally. Part of this was circumstance. By late 1944, Allied air superiority over Europe was so complete that German fighters rarely challenged bomber formations. The window for aerial gunners to become aces had closed. Aruth had been in the right place at the right time with the right combination of skill, courage, and innovative thinking. Michael Aruth died in February 1990 at the age of 70. His obituary in the Springfield Republican mentioned his service and his medals, but didn't explain what he'd accomplished. A few surviving veterans attended his funeral. They knew at the service Massachusetts Representative Richard Neal Reed a tribute into the congressional record calling Aruth one of the forgotten heroes of the Second World War. The lesson of Michael Aruth's story isn't complicated. Sometimes the people closest to a problem see solutions that the experts miss. Sometimes the kid who dropped out of high school understands what the men with advanced degrees don't. Sometimes courage means trusting your own observations over accepted doctrine. And sometimes the difference between survival and death comes down to one person willing to break the rules when the rules are getting people killed. 750 men came home from the war because a skinny kid from Massachusetts figured out a better way to fight. He never asked for recognition. He just did the job. And that's probably the most remarkable thing about him. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which historical figure we should cover next.